Hey, welcome to our Kivy tutorial where we talk about formatting. In part one, we'll talk about labels and their key properties such as size, font size, text size, and texture size. What's the difference between these things and how can we use them? Check it out.
So from reading on the forums, there's quite a bit of confusion around Kivy labels and the different properties it has, such as size, font size, text size, and texture size. So I've set up this little app to show you what these different properties are and how they interact and how you can change them to get certain effects. So the code of this app itself is not really part of this video. If you want me to do a video on how I coded this app, by all means leave a comment and I'll show you the code of the app in detail. But what I want to do right now is just focus on the label. So my label in question is this big gray label here with some default text in here, some text in my label. The properties of the label as it is the size of the label is 770 by 385. That is defined by the gray box. The font size is 15 by default. That is the size of the characters. The text size is none by default. Now the text size is actually the size of the text bounding box, which we will come across later again. At the moment, this by default is just none. And then there's a texture size right here, which is 181 by 18. Now, what is a texture size? The texture size is the size that is taken up by the image of the text. Now, what's the image of the text? That's really just the space that this text takes up. So that's a function of its font size, of course, and how much text you type. So at the moment, that seems to be 181 pixels and 18 pixels high. 18 pixels high. So that is, it's no coincidence that is just a few pixels more than the font size of 15. We will see that when we change the font size later, the texture size will change accordingly. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do, and I've kind of listed the things I would like to go through here, is change the font size. So remember the number 770 by 385. If we change the font size, this shouldn't change because the size of the label isn't going to change. The text size is actually not going to change because it will still be none. But the texture size, which is the space that the text takes up, that will change. So let's have a look. So it is 181 by 18. So if we, let's say, change the font size to 50, then what we get much bigger text, of course. The font size is now 50. As you can see, the size of the label hasn't changed. It's still 770 by 385. The text size is still none, but the texture size has increased. So it's become wider, 596. It used to be 181. And 59, which again is no coincidence that it's just a little bit higher than the font size. The second thing I wanted to show you is to change the text size to fit the label. Now, why do we want to do that? We'll see that in a second. Let's leave the font size at 50 and let's change the text size to self.size. What does that mean? So text size, the size of the bounding box around the text, I want that to take up the size of self, and self is my label. So in other words, the text size should become the same size as the label. Let's have a look. So my label size hasn't changed. It's still the same, 770 by 385. But now you can see that my text size has taken up the same size as has my texture size. So now all three are the same size. The font size is still 50. I didn't change that. But of course, what you are seeing now is a text which used to be nicely centered has now moved to the bottom left corner of my label. Now, that's not really what I want, but it leads me to the next point, which is if you set your size of your text to be the size of your label, the only reason I can think of you doing that is if you want to align your text within the label. So by default, it was centered. But if I don't want it to be centered, say I want it to be top right, or say I want it to be in the middle, but right aligned, but middle vertically. So let's see what that means. So that means I can use H-align and V-align, so horizontal alignment and vertical alignment. I want it to center to the right horizontally, but center vertically. So let's run that. Now you can see everything else stayed the same. So the size of the label, the text size, or the size of the text bounding box, and the texture size, the size of the text image, are still the same. The font size is still 50, but you will now see that the text is right aligned horizontally, and it's in the middle vertically. Now the other thing you can do is to actually make the label shrink such that it fits nicely around your text. So for that, let's comment this out, because then we don't want to do this. Let's leave the font size at 60, but let's set the label size to fit the text. And there's actually two things you need to do. In the Kivy documentation, you will find this line, right, which says the size, which is the size of your label. I want to set that equal to my texture size. Remember, that is the size of the image that is taken up by my text, right? So that is basically the size of my text. So from self, which is my label, I call the texture size property and make my label equal to that size. Now, you have to put the size hint to none, and that is kind of hidden in the documentation. If you don't do that, nothing will happen. So if you actually, I can show you that. So if I run this, this will just again be my default label. Nothing's really changed. My font size is 50. My size here is what it should be. My text size is none, and my texture size is just the size of the image. That is not what I wanted. I wanted my label to shrink around my text. So if I set the size hint to none, you will then see that my label has now wrapped itself around my text. The size of the label is now 596 by 59, which is the same as my texture size. And that should be no surprise, because that's exactly what we said. The size here needs to be the same as the texture size. There's two more things I want to show you. One, let's go back to the default. So in here, so your size of the label is 770 by 385. And your text size is nothing, your texture size is 596 by 59. If I make my screen bigger, you can see that the size of my label changes, gets bigger, but my texture size does not, because my font size doesn't change. The number of pixels taken up by my font and by my text is still the same, so my texture size doesn't change. If I make it smaller again, you see the size of the label changes, but not the texture size. So the last thing I wanted to show you is what happens if you change text size. We haven't done that yet. So, well, we have done it before to set the text size equal to the size of the label. That's when we did the alignment. But what if we give the text size a fixed value? If we want this box to be, a certain value, what does that do? Well, you can do that. As opposed to with the texture size is not something you can change programmatically. It is calculated automatically as a function of your text, of course, how much text you've typed and the font of it, but you can't change that yourself. Text size, however, you can. So let's have a look at what happens. Now, this is a long, large text. It says some text in my main label. Now, what if I change the text size to something different, say a box of 10 centimeters by 2 centimeters? What happens then? Then it looks like I only get to see main label. So the size of the label hasn't changed, neither has the font, but now my texture size has reduced. So it has taken up the size of the text size that I defined. Now, I defined it in centimeters. This will show it in pixels. But you can see that you can now only see part of the main text. Now, in this particular situation, you can read two words, main label. Now, if you set the size to be different, the text size, for example, you might only see a little part of that. So, for example, if instead I take a box of 10 centimeters by only a half centimeter high, what does that give me? Well, you can see that you can only now see a tiny little bit of the text. This is actually still main label. But you can hardly read it. But again, your texture size has now been changed to take up the size of the text size. And if you make that 75, for example, and this 5, you get a different part. You get part of label, but only part of the height. Anyway, so again, I'm not entirely sure how this can be useful, but this is just to show you that the text size is set separately. The text size is literally the part of the texture that you want to show. There you go. So these are the main properties of a label. I hope you found that interesting or useful. If so, please leave a comment, like the video, or even consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much. See ya. Bye-bye.